Hey there, in this video I'll show you the Stonethorn version of my Templar healer build for dungeons and arenas. As I'm using this build a lot and it has become kind of a staple of this channel, I am very happy to tell you that while there was some adaptation necessary, many Stonethorn changes were actually in its favor and the build is just super strong right now. But let me give you a quick summary of the build so you know if this video is even for you. It is a off-healer build, meaning a hybrid between healer and damage dealer, bringing considerable damage while still being fully capable to heal and support. This is in my opinion the most effective playstyle if you want to play as a healer in 4-player content, as the damage is only slightly behind a 3 damage dealer group while still having the benefits of a healer. It is also very strong for pickup groups in my opinion, since the versatility allows for countering a group's weaknesses and gives a huge carry potential. I would recommend this build especially for experienced players, however I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from beginners on the previous versions as well. In this video we'll go over the main build, additional set and skill options, the rotation and how to utilize it in actual combat. But one more thing before we actually get into the build. There are quite a lot of changes this time and I completely dropped my previous main setup of Olorim and False God because there are significantly stronger options now. That said, Olorim and False God is still a fun and viable setup to play. For details on it, please refer to my Greymore build, the link is in the description. But let's get started with the new build now, and here's an overview that I will talk you through step by step. For the race, I recommend Breton, as the combination of very strong sustain passives and survivability provides you with a lot of value and allows you to focus more on the offensive stats in other aspects of the build. Other good choices would be Altmer, Dunmer and Khajiit, which all offer more offensive potential but will require more sustain in return. I would not recommend being a vampire nor a werewolf, as they offer nothing to the build and in case of vampirism even make it weaker. As the Mundus stone, I use Thief, as crit gives the highest DPS increase on this build and increases the healing as well. For the general stat balance there are 2 good options. You can go with Magicka and Health Food and all attribute points into Magicka. This will give you the best damage, but will be pretty hard to sustain, so I would only recommend it for playing with well-coordinated and especially DPS-heavy groups, because quicker fights of course make it a lot easier to sustain. For a safer and easier to sustain build, I would recommend using food with additional Magicka regeneration, and then up to 20 points into health, depending on what you're comfortable with. In terms of potions, the ideal choice would be spell power, but for easier content, Magicka drop pods are fine in my opinion. In the Greymore video, I showed you 2 gear options, and funny enough, both sets of my primary setup got nerfed, while both sets of my alternative setup got massively buffed. So as I already said, I ditched Olorim and False God completely. I will however still show you some alternative gear options. All gear options I will show you will be 7 pieces of light armor, as it is the only possible combination. You ideally would want 5 light, 1 medium, 1 heavy though, so keep that in mind if you go with other sets, especially with crafted ones for example. My primary setup is Spell Power Cure and Master Architect. Major Courage is one of the strongest buffs a healer can provide, so you have basically the choice between the 2 Major Courage sets, and Spell Power Cure is the clearly superior one now in my opinion, as it is easier to keep up, more versatile and provides better stats. The second set, Master Architect, has seen some huge buffs with Stonethorn and is just ridiculously strong at the moment. Firstly, it affects up to 6 players now, so accidentally buffing the tank and only 1 damage dealer or something like that can't happen anymore. Secondly, it scales with the amount of ultimate you spend now, and that is based on the ultimate points you currently have and not the cost of the ultimate you use, so you can spend up to 500 ultimate points for 35 seconds of Major Slayer. This lets you save your ultimate for the right moment and allows for insane burst phases. Of course, this works best in coordinated groups where you can time it with a Warhorn from the tank and the 2 ultimates of both damage dealers for example, but it is still very strong for less coordinated groups as well. Because I want to double bar both sets, using 1 Maelstrom weapon and a monster set like usually isn't possible, so I decided to go with double Maelstrom weapons over a monster set, as it provides a lot more value in my opinion. Maelstrom Lightning Staff front bar is simply a huge DPS increase if you are good with weaving, and Maelstrom Healing Staff is a pretty strong sustain tool at the moment. A cool thing about this new version of my build also is that it does not rely on the specific set combinations to function, so you're a lot more flexible with these set choices. I would personally never replace Spell Power Cure, but you can do so with Olorim if you prefer that set, as Major Courage is simply too important. However, you can situationally replace Master Architect for basically any support set. I think the two most interesting choices here are Hollowfang Thirst for sustain and Gossamer for survival. You could of course also replace the Maelstrom weapons with a monster set, which is probably a good choice if you really want even more survival or resource support, as this is what the normal setup is kind of lacking. For easy to get gear, I would recommend Spell Power Cure and Mother's Sorrow with normal Maelstrom weapons, or as an even easier to get option, Willpower weapons. Moving on to traits and enchantments, I'm running full Divines with Magicka, however you can also run a few health enchantments if you play with Wreck Food, basically instead of using the attribute points for that. On the jewelry I use 3 times infused spell power, but you could also use a cane, as there is almost no difference. For the weapons, Infused Berserker backbar and Precise Shock frontbar is still showing the best results in terms of damage, while also providing support with the shock status effect. Let's look at the champion points next. So for the recipe, I'm using a balanced setup, as I don't think it makes sense to just use CP for specific dungeons. PvE is generally very magic damage heavy, however being a Breton Templar already gives me a whole lot of spell resistance, so I focus quite a bit on physical resistance in DCP. But if you aren't a Breton, you should put probably 20 to 30 points more into Spell Shield and Elemental Defender instead of Hardy and Light Armor focus. So what I use is 72 Ironclad, 48 Spell Shield, 15 Light Armor focus, 37 Hardy, 61 Thick-Skinned, and 37 Elemental Defender. For the blue CP, I use 22 Spell Erosion, 56 Elemental Expert, 66 Elfborn, 56 Master at Arms, 19 Staff Expert, and 51 Thaumaturge. As you can see, I have no points in Blast, as I think it is simply not necessary and would lose me damage. If you are playing with the same group for longer periods, you should also consider adjusting the penetration to the specific group. The green CP come mostly down to how you sustain and what defensive tools you prefer. I personally dodge a lot instead of blocking and like using heavy attacks during damage stops to sustain, so that is what I focus on in the green CP, ending up with 76 Arcanist, 64 Tenacity for my Magicka sustain, and 40 Warlord, 19 Bashing Focus, 23 Shadow Ward, 48 Tumbling for the defensive stuff. So skills and passives are up next. The heal of Ritual of Retribution being gone has really given me some headaches, but while I personally absolutely hate the change, I still found a skill layout that works really well and stays true to the idea of having a simple yet multifunctional kit that allows for doing all 4-player content well without consistently changing out skills and stuff. I ultimately decided to drop Ritual in favor of Purifying Light, as it preserves the functionality of the build while also doing really good damage, being easy to sustain and allowing for a reasonable rotation. So my spammable is still Puncturing Sweeps. It is strong for both AoE and single target, especially with the Burning Light changes, while making you basically immortal, so well, what else can you ask for? For the execute, I use Radiant Oppression because it does insane damage and also gives you the option to play partially ranged. Purifying Light is the first dot, even though it technically isn't, but we treat it as one in the rotation. And that is also the first of the 2 hots. The healing isn't super strong, but it is certainly strong enough for us to need a lot less burst healing, especially on the tank. The 2 other dots on the front bar are Unstable Wall for the Maelstrom Staff effect, and Mythic Orb for the very important synergy. On the back bar, I run another 2 dots, Solar Barrage and Blazing Spear. I also have my primary healing skill on the back bar, namely Combat Prayer, which is a strong enough burst heal to take care of basically everything, and of course also one of the most important support abilities for the damage increase. My second thought is Radiating Regeneration, which works really well with Purifying Light, as it counters its biggest weakness by being independent from positioning. And of course, it is also used for sustain with the Maelstrom healing staff. And the last skill in my setup is Radiant Aura for the Minor Magicka steel. There are also a few alternative or situational skills you should take into consideration. Illustrious Healing can replace Radiating Regeneration if you don't use the Maelstrom Restoration stuff, or be a third hot if you need it. Elemental Drain and Siphon Spirit can both replace Radiant Aura depending on the effect you need. Channeled Acceleration and Channeled Focus can both be situational skills for either more damage or more survival. Force Pulse can be an alternative to Puncturing Sweeps if you prefer to play ranged. And lastly, Ritual of Retribution can be an alternative dot, especially if you need the cleanse. My ultimates also somewhat changed from Greymore, as the entire point of this build is to save up ultimate for a strong burst phase. I almost exclusively use Elemental Rage. You can however do the same thing with Warhorn, Barrier or Nova if your group needs it. For that you can have the ultimate of your choice on your backbar in addition to Elemental Rage. I don't use Crescent Sweep at all anymore, as the cast time has simply made it unbearable to use. However, you can still slot it for the passives. Similar to that, you can also slot Meteor for the major skill passives. Moving on to set passives, you want to have all class trees, everything from Restoration Staff, Destruction Staff and Light Armor. Banish the Wicked from Fighter's Guild. If you play with a Meteor, Everlasting Magic and Magicka Controller from the Mage's Guild. Both Undaunted passives, all racial passives, and from crafting, medicinal use from alchemy, as well as gourmand and connoisseur from provisioning. Before we look at the rotation in detail, I just want to quickly explain something. This kind of build sucks for dummy testing. Some features of the build simply don't work outside of a group, and the build is entirely designed for short and dynamic fights you usually find in dungeons, and not for a 6 to 8 minute static damage phase. Nevertheless, dummy testing still provides important information, so I decided to do 2 different tests to have some more representative data. The first test is the potential DPS when not providing any support or healing, which is 45k dispatch, and the second one is with keeping up all healing and support, which is 47k. Both tests were made with Ghastly Eyeball because sustain is one of the things that don't properly work on the dummy. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the results, and I think this method will be providing a lot more value for your testing as well as future builds. But let's talk about the actual rotation now. I'm using a partially static, partially dynamic rotation, which sounds complicated, but is actually a very convenient thing to do as a healer, as you will always need to play at least somewhat dynamic anyway to react to incoming damage and mechanics. So what I'm doing is recasting my 4 dots, Unstable Wall, Mythic Orb, Blazing Spear and Solar Barrage, followed by Purifying Light in a 10-second static rotation. In the remaining time, I then dynamically use my healing, support and spammable, keeping up everything I currently need, reacting to incoming damage and further pushing the DPS with the spammable. While almost nothing really lines up outside of the dots, it really doesn't have to actually, as you're mostly using it in reaction to the current situation instead of when it runs out. For example, when you need a burst heal, you use Combat Prayer and also refresh the buff by doing so. In static damage phases, you will find that you barely have time to use Puncturing Sweeps or Radiant Oppression, which you use instead of sweeps under 30%. However, where both skills really start to shine is when it's not worth recasting your dots before damage stops, during movement phases, or at the end of the fight. Of course, I'm also weaving throughout this entire rotation whenever possible. When putting this rotation into practice, situational awareness, good positioning, and reaction speed are important to really make the best out of the limited healing you have. That is the coolest part about being an off-healer for me. It is more challenging, but in return also more rewarding, because by streamlining and cutting out skills you only use for your own convenience, like Breath of Life for example, you end up with a stronger build and as a better player. You always want to be in a good position in relation to your group and don't get separated from it. I would recommend either staying in the back or at the side of your target with both damage dealers on one side of you. You then want to pay close attention to the behavior of your group and upcoming mechanics, so you know when and especially how to react. Of course, the worst thing as a healer is having a group that doesn't collaborate with you. It can of course help to call out bad behavior, but especially in pickup groups, my experience is that players often won't listen. In this case, it is usually the best call to leave them to their fate and focus on your own damage instead of chasing them around like crazy. Because the beauty of this build is that you can always just choose to be a damage dealer. But that's it for this video. As always, I hope you will have fun and success with my build. Feel free to leave me any feedback and questions in a comment, and thank you for watching.